Serious. What is the creepiest, most blood-chilling thing you or someone you know have ever experienced? When I was 16, my parents went out of town for a weekend. It was actually pretty sweet because I got to be king of the castle for the weekend. So I get home that Friday night and just stick around. Internet, video games, etc. and start watching TV around dusk. The way our living room was set up was that there was a set of glass doors right next to the television that looked out to the back porch backyard. The backyard was surrounded by ivy that grew on a hill around a 45-degree angle. So I'm just mindlessly channel surfing and I see some movement outside. At first I just dismiss it thinking it's a bird or a neighborhood cat or something, but I then notice that whatever is moving is way bigger than a bird or cat. I go and put my face near the glass and stare into the backyard. And there's some dude just crouching in the ivy looking into the house. Our eyes meet and he has somewhat of an "oh, shit" moment and bolts out of our yard. Scared the shit out me. My mom had a stalker for years. She was maybe in her early 30s, I was about 3 and my brother was around 1 when this started. My dad would leave for work in the morning and as soon as he was gone, the calls would start coming in. She'd answer the phone and some guy would be saying all this horribly sadistic and sexual things about what he wanted to do to my mom. She was beyond frightened and didn't know what to do. Sometimes the caller would describe what she was wearing at that very minute or describe what she was doing. My parents were struggling financially, so they couldn't just up and move, but my mom started spending more and more time at my dad's mother's house when he was away. The cops got involved, but they couldn't trace the call. Finally, they were able to save up enough money to move. I was about 6 by this time. The phone number was changed and unlisted in the phone book. This was around 1988 when everyone still used landlines. My mom never got another scary phone call, but she had nightmares about it for years. When I was little, I remember going into her bedroom in the morning and she would be sobbing into her pillow. I didn't understand it at that point, but she explained later in life that she'd wake up from a nightmare and just shake and cry. A couple months after we had moved, the cops informed us that they finally caught the guy. It was our next-door neighbor's 19-year-old son. He had been in the military but was discharged due to severe mental illness. I guess he was put into some sort of special security home that specializes in mental health. The lead investigator said that the son was obsessed with my mother and they found a box in his room full of a bunch of photographs candidly taken of her when she was out in the garden or playing with us kids in the yard. It chills me to the bone when I think about it now. Anything could have happened to my mother when my dad was at work and it'd be too young to help her. On April 18th of this year, I came home from work and began working on some homework. After 30 minutes of homework my aunt entered my mother's bedroom and began screaming hysterically, ordering me to call 911. Once I was on the line with the operator, she asked what the nature of my emergency was. I didn't quite know so I entered my mother's bedroom to find her dead of a heart attack and laying face down on the floor, wedged between her nightstand and her bed. The operator dispatched the paramedics and instructed me on how to perform CPR. In order to do so, I had to flip my mother onto her back. When I grabbed my mother's cold, lifeless arm, I realized that she couldn't be moved as she was wedged firmly between her bed and her nightstand and rigor mortis had already set in. I was unable to flip her over and I had never seen her touch a dead body before. After the paramedics came and told me that nothing could be done, the medical examiner informed my family that she couldn't be seen as she had been laying on her face for so long. It's assumed by my family that she hit her head on the way down as her dentures were on the floor beside her. The combination of her head trauma and the fact that she had been dead for many hours had rendered her unviewable as deemed by the officer from the medical examiner's office. To answer your question, the sight and feeling of my mother's deceased body is the most chilling thing that I have ever seen. Her memorial is this Sunday. I've got one. In college I worked security for extra money. One of my regular assignments was the overnight shift at a metal fabrication factory. One of the primary reasons I was there was to ensure that no one broke in to steal all the valuable metal that was stocked on site. Which was an occasional problem. That, in turn, involved checking the perimeter fence for damage at least once a shift. That couldn't be done effectively by camera, it instead required physically walking the fence. So it was that one night I was walking the perimeter fence in the middle of a thunderstorm. My attention was on the beam of my flashlight illuminating the fence as I walked past. So, I wasn't really focused on where I was walking, despite walking through grass that was a bit over my waist. Apparently I just stepped awkwardly on a patch of particularly slick grass or mud as I was heading downhill, but before I knew what was happening, I had slid feet first into an open storm sewer. Some asshole had stolen the manhole cover recently, and the edges around the opening were wet with rain and mud, thanks to the storm. Let me just take a moment to explain this storm sewer. First off, it was shaped just like an oubliette. If you're not familiar with what that is, picture a concrete cell that is shaped like a jug, a small opening at the top with sides that slope inward to prevent someone from crawling out. In this case, the bottom was maybe 10 feet square, and the opening for the manhole was about twice the normal width in the center of the ceiling. There was no ladder attached, and the fall was maybe 20 feet down. At the bottom, the floor was sloped to form 2 trenches in the shape of a cross. There were sewer channels going off in 4 directions, but they were only maybe a foot wide across and were blocked with metal grates. At the bottom, there were debris, including a number of large broken pieces of rebar. There were several pieces that were pointing straight up. I definitely would have impaled myself on several jagged points of rusty metal had I hit the bottom. So, no way to escape, a long fall and a probable disabling injury at the bottom. I somehow caught myself by hooking the edge of the opening on my elbow as I fell in. I dropped my flashlight to the bottom of the pit before I stopped my momentum, so I had a great view of all that broken rebar below me while I was struggling to escape. Maybe that was the collapsed remains of the ladder. As I tried to get another handhold, my cell phone skipped out of my pocket and hit the bottom. It felt like forever before I somehow pulled myself out of that opening. I don't doubt adrenaline gave me a considerable boost of strength, but even so, I nearly lost my hold on the edge 3 times before I managed to scramble out. I was kin to just jerking my knees towards the opening and jumping a couple inches thanks to the momentum. My free hand kept scrambling for something solid to grab, but I never really found anything. I'm honestly not sure how exactly I pulled myself out just using the surface tension between the mud and concrete in my hands and forearm. It felt like a miracle. All I could think of after I pulled myself out was how I wasn't due to be relieved for another 7 hours. 7 hours before anyone would even start wondering where I was, and that whole time I might have been trapped at the bottom of a pit, impaled on some rods of rebar, in the rain. I also wanted to kill whoever stole that manhole cover. I was home for the summer from college, and my mother and brother had just headed out for a few day trip to visit colleges. This meant I was to take care of my father. Dad. Something was clearly wrong, but we couldn't tell what. He had Parkinson's, but it was more than that. But we figured I could handle him. This is when I came to realize something in his broken mind hated me with a passion. He wouldn't listen to anything I said. Now I admit I was pissed off, so I wasn't doing a terrific job, but even simple things like getting him food was an hour-long ordeal that ended with us shouting. This last time, I called Mom on the house phone, because at least he'd listen to her. I gave him one phone, and I was on another, yelling at each other through it even though we were 5 feet apart. Poor Mom trying to referee from a few hundred miles away. Finally, Dad hangs up his phone and hands it to me. Oh, he's done, thank God, I think. But then he tries to take the still active phone from my hand, which I refuse. And that's when it happens. It gives me chills to this day. A change came over him. It was subtle, but he stood slightly straighter. It was like for a moment someone else was in his body. He stared at me, and in the most calm, cold voice I have ever heard, said, "I'm going to kill you." There was no emotion behind it. There was no energy. He said it as fact. I was stunned. Mom heard it over the phone. As I stood there, paralyzed, her voice broke through in a whisper. Run. I threw the phone at Dad, rounded the corner and grabbed my keys. My car screamed out of the driveway. It was pure animal instinct for me at that point. I had to run. Because if I stayed there, Dad didn't really remember what happened. He was confused as to why I was suddenly gone. I have no idea what went on in his head at that moment, but I stared into something back there. Not necessarily paranormal, but this was something that both creeped me out quite thoroughly and chilled my blood to ice water. I was working at a crematory funeral home at the time. I just picked up the body of a girl my age from the county coroner's office and was going through the check-in procedure, which consisted of lots of paperwork, fingerprints, documentation of belongings, etc. Now when a body comes to us from the coroner, it's typically an unexpected death that occurred under questionable circumstances. This particular one, I could tell by simply looking at her, was a drug overdose. She had very obvious injection sites in her arms, thigh, one on her foot, and what appeared to be needle marks all over her lower abdomen. It looked like this chick went to fucking town stabbing herself in the belly. This was strange to me, because I know that isn't a typical place to inject drugs. Especially because this girl was a bit on the large side, nor is it usually a place where the pathologist will draw fluids in a case like this. Anyway, I shrugged it off and began to document her personal items, which come to us zipped up in the body bag in a black trash bag. Usually the coroner's office provides a detailed list of belongings for liability reasons. This case came with no such list, so it surprised me to see that she did indeed have a property bag with her, tucked under a leg. I tore the bag open and out flopped a fully developed, completely green dead baby with a very smooshed head. You can imagine my shock. Opening the bag, expecting to find shoes, clothes, maybe a wallet, and instead a tiny human plopping out. Long story short, and the family did not know, and telling them was horrifying in and of itself. There was absolutely no sort of documentation on this fully developed human, and the coroner was just as shocked as we were. Some jackass autopsy tech had just stuffed the baby in a bag in hopes of us not finding it and cremating it to save themselves some time on paperwork and dealing with an already distraught family. An autopsy was done on the baby, family and friends were questioned, the whole 9 yards. Later a friend of the deceased disclosed that she was the only one who the girl had told about being pregnant. And her plans to try and give herself a late-stage abortion by injecting heroin straight into her womb. Pretty fucked. Needless to say, I was always hesitant when opening property bags in fear of finding another dead, green infant as opposed to a pair of Nikes. I used to take care of a developmentally disabled man in a community protection program. He had to be kept away from people because of his sudden violent outbursts. His parents were rich and bought an old farmhouse on 10 acres or so about 4 miles out of town so that he could be away from the public and not forced into a psych ward. For 4 years I worked there on a 56-hour shift. Come in on Sunday evening and leave Wednesday afternoon. There were 2 of us on these shifts and we were both supposed to be there the entire 56 hours, but because we were the most senior trainers on staff we'd take turns going home on 1-2 of the nights. After 3 years of being in that house I had become comfortable with it, despite it being so isolated and overall kind of creepy. I would always stay up and watch TV until around midnight. My client was always locked in his room around 8 p.m. One night, about 12:15 a.m. I turned the TV off and pulled the covers over myself to try and get some sleep on the nastiest futon ever. There was one window in the staff room and it faced the back of the property and was about 6 feet off the ground. I had just started drifting to sleep when I heard the most blood-curdling woman scream from right outside the window. I popped up so fast that I nearly lost consciousness and had to steady myself in the doorway while the scream continued and then faded away. I grabbed a flashlight from the laundry room and threw open the back door illuminating the area outside the window, and there was nothing. I ran along the perimeter of the house and saw nothing. I watched the sun come up the next morning desperately glued to the TV trying to distract myself from what had happened. All of the people I worked with were much older than me, and there was no good reason to play a prank like that in the middle of January in Eastern Oregon. I'm sure there's an explanation, but it bothers me to this day. I went to see a movie with a friend of mine. It was dark when we got out of the movie, and she offered me a ride home, but it was pretty short walk, nice night, and I live in really safe town. Usually. So I start to walk home. I guess I should mention, I'm a woman, and a particularly small one. About 2 blocks into my walk I hear yelling and screaming moaning. I look and these 2 guys in hoodies are kicking something, but I can't see what because there is this short cement wall blocking my view. They shout something, nod at me, and take off in the opposite direction. So I run to where they had been. That all happened very quickly. I get there and there is this homeless man. It's really dark, but he's obviously hurt badly. He has a blanket. He was clearly sleeping when these guys came up and attacked him. I actually recognized him, not by name, but it's a small town, and I've seen him around. He gets up and grabs his blanket and looks around for a minute. I try to talk to him, but he just can't really talk to me. He's quite mentally ill and has now been hit in the head, and he's just terrified. He takes a couple steps as I'm calling 911 and ends up under a street light. His head and face are covered in blood with some dirt caked over it. To the point I can't see any skin on his face. He's way too spooked to let me try to help. I'm explaining to 911 the situation, but mostly just begging for an ambulance. They want to know about the 2 guys, of course, but I didn't see them well, and I have this guy bleeding from his head in front of me. And then he starts walking. I have no way to stop him, so I just follow a little bit behind because I don't want to be an extra thing that terrifies him, but I also need to update 911 where we are. We made it like 8 blocks before the fire truck intercepted us. I am shocked he makes it that far. No one else is out. 911 keeps wanting me to give a more detailed description, which is the one point I lost it a little bit. He's the only guy covered in blood walking down street name. Sorry, 911 operator. I cannot describe how relieved I was when the fire truck showed up. The police talked to me for a little bit. Then they left, the guy had been transported and the fire truck was gone. All of a sudden everyone was gone and I was just standing there on an empty street in the dark. I took a step to start to walk home, now farther than where I started. And decided to call my friend instead. She drove back and took me home. The guy with the head injury lived. The two terrible humans who did that were never caught. I saw a man get shot pretty much point blank in the face in early 2000s. I was in a bar in Moscow waiting for a friend, chatting with a bartender. I hear a commotion next to me as I see a guy take a step back, whip out a gun, point at a guy's face and pull a trigger. The guy just slumped and hit the floor, and that's when I saw blood. Immediate ringing in the ears, screams, and folks froze as we thought this guy will continue shooting. Turns out, the guy was in the police force and shot this guy as he was part of some sort of a gang who have murdered another cop from his station. I was around 10, very early 90s, we've just moved to Moscow from a small town in Siberia and bought new furniture. Turns out the furniture store forgot one of the items and said that someone will drop it off tomorrow. Not uncommon in Russia, kids were okay being home alone even at 10. So I am at home after school when two dudes knock on the door carrying a box, saying that they are from the furniture store. They were not. I got tied up and roughed up and they robbed the house clean but left me alive. I was able to identify one of them a year later, while the other one was killed in a car accident. Karma equals bitch. The first guy got 7 years of hard labor and I am sure has been releasing silent farts from the first day there. Also Moscow 93, when Yeltsin decided to fire upon the Duma. Just the amount of dead people laid out to be identified by their relatives, wailing mothers and wives. The smell of burnt rubber and crackling glass under feet. What struck me the most was how there would be a janitor next to some big-wig politicians laying there side by side with their head propped up on the brick, all equal in death. That one scared me for a while, as of course my friend and I snuck out without our parents knowing. I guess the lesson learned there was that at the end of the game all chess pieces go into the same box. When my friend's dad was around 17 years old, he decided to go camping with about 8 or so of his friends. This took place in the Wisconsin forest. When they got to the site, they decided to split up to collect firewood in groups of 2 and meet back at the site in around 20 minutes. One group wasn't back right away, and since they were a couple, they just assumed they were fornicating in some bushes and cracked a couple jokes about it. After around an hour they decided they should probably go look for them and headed off to search in the area they had been collecting wood. They saw behind a bush part of the girl's bloody shirt and the man's shoes were lying scattered around the scene. They quickly rushed back to their car so they could drive to the park ranger's office, which was about 5 miles away, and report the incident. However, they found that their gas had been siphoned, so they had no choice but to walk. On their walk back to the office, they saw a semi pass by with one driver and 2 faces pressed up against a window, which they believe were their friends begging for help. The 2 friends were reported missing and have never been found to this day. Some years back now, my mom went on a vacation with a friend of hers to Florida or somewhere for a week and a half during the winter, so I was alone at home for the time and took advantage of it by setting up my consoles on the big living room TV. One night it was snowing and throughout the night I felt really uncomfortable. Granted, this was day 6 of 11 and I've never actually been alone in the house for that long before, so I just chalked it up to loneliness. The snow stopped sometime in the middle of the night. I went to sleep on the couch around 2 a.m. Next morning, plows came down the street and cleared them up as usual. I had left to pick up some stuff at the store down the street, but I stopped almost immediately when I got off my porch. There were footprints in the snow leading up to the large bay window on the side of the house, a set leading towards and away. The ones leading in were slightly filled from snowfall, then there were 2 footprints positioned right next to the far corner of the window, close to the rear porch and some largish bushes that were finely detailed and pointed towards the wall. Someone had been standing outside the window for a while, at least, staring into my house, and left when the snow stopped. The tracks started and ended at the street, so where they came from and where they went afterwards were destroyed by the plows. I have since bought large tin sheets to cover said window, hung thick dark curtains, and rearranged furniture to cover the entire bottom 1/3 of the entire window length. Fuck that shit ever again. I'm a 31-year-old man, and the idea of someone just staring into my house through the windows gives me the kind of tense anxious horror I felt when I almost fell off a 15 cliff. I can't even sit by windows at night without fully closing curtains. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please drop a like, and to stay up to date with my latest videos, make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel by clicking the button under this video.